All right, so let's get back into this. There is a recording going for YouTube. I don't know why it's not functioning, but because WebEx allows you to chat directly, it's a little simpler. I will post a message, an announcement. This is like the 5th time YouTube has given me some trouble, and I think just to make it easier, if I can record the WebEx, which reminds me.
This meeting is being recorded.
Great. If I can record the WebEx, then I can post that directly to Web Campus, and then we'll just sort of move away from YouTube. I hate that that's the solution, but between the camera, I can't connect the camera to both. Having both is just not working. And WebEx is in Web Campus, so it's a little easier. Really? Okay. So let's get back into this. So we're talking about pluralism, and we're talking about polyarchy sort of combining. Right, we talked about pluralism. Now, when we combine these two, it's important that we understand that they coexist very well in they exist very well in a democratic regime, right? That polyarchy sets up all of the institutions, it sets up the rules, right? What you can and cannot do, right? So you have the free speech, you have the alternative information, you have the autonomous organizations. So you have this sort of framework for a pluralist society. And then the pluralist society, what it does is it takes that framework and allows the individuals to sort of compete for ideas. So it's not just that they have the right, but now they have the tools, right? Pluralism gives them the tools in the organization to do so, right? So these are very connected ideas. Now, what's important here is that if you have a polyarchy, you can produce pluralism. It's sufficient, right? If you give people the freedom to join, to organize how they want, and they get different information and they can speak out with that information, then they're going to organize groups. It will sort of a naturally occurring process. And when you have both, right, you're going to have more democratic aspects of a government. The other part is that you really need these organizations for a large-scale democracy, right? The elected officials aren't going to take up every issue all the time. They're just not going to, right? That they're going to prioritize the issues that help them with elections or help them with their base, right? That you need some organizations that are singular focused, right? Now, however you feel, I think the NRA just went bankrupt, but the NRA fought for gun rights. The only thing they fought for was gun ownership rights, right? Or concealed carry, or whatever their version of Second Amendment rights was, they were single issue. And so you didn't have as many government officials constantly discussing those policies because you had an organization dealing with it, right? AARP is just dealing with retirement issues, right? Mothers Against Drunk Driving are just trying to make drunk driving laws have a higher punishment, right? Their behavior is very different than a government because they can organize a lot of people across a large geography, right, a lot of territory under a single purpose. So they really have a value and a place in a democracy. That doesn't mean that these both don't have negative aspects. Now, the first is, I mentioned Snyder and his 70 sovereign people, and when he talks about organizations, is that they're not always equal, right? That sometimes the organizations are set up that one of the organizations has all of the power and the influence and the money, and it will help maintain inequalities. What we saw is the wealth, right, in the South, right, the wealth and the political organization belonged to the white majority. And because of that, what happened is they set up a system, they used their organizations to set up a system that maintained their power structure, that maintained inequalities between whites and blacks in the South. Intentionally, right? Pluralism gave them the ability to do this through organization. The other part about pluralism is it's very easy to sharpen, right? To sort of make it seem like another person is so different that they're damaging the country, right? This idea of the other, right? When East Coasters, when people from the Southeast, right, when we're talking about sort of the southern states, Tennessee and Georgia, and right, northern Florida, because southern Florida behaves its own way, right? But when they talk about the West Coast, their understanding of what West Coast people are like, right, or if you're from Texas or the Midwest, when people talk about the West Coast, specifically when we talk about like California or Seattle, Washington, right, that there's always thing about like extreme liberalism, and it's very easy when you're organized to point at another group and say they are different, they're the other, and we have to be organized against them. Now, because it's easier to exaggerate a person's interests, right, as sort of anti someone else, you have a lot of commentary, right? One of the things that has happened in Southern California, right, is that there is a belief among Republicans that immigrants are bankrupting the state, right? Now, this isn't true. Illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants or whatever terminology, individuals who are not born in the United States, whose parents weren't born in the United States, right? People come into the United States from somewhere else, right? Republicans have sort of created this idea that it's causing economic damage to California. Now, one, except for the pandemic, California is a massive economy. It has all of these different venues to make money, right? So it's not a struggling economy, right? Anyone who told you, I mean, today, right, we have to take the pandemic as an exception, right? Other than the pandemic, California is a very strong economy, a very sound economy, which has a lot of ways to make money, right? It has corporations, right? Corporate headquarters, it has Silicon Valley, right? It has all the coast, right? It has the ports, it has the industry, right? Hollywood, it has so many ways to make money. But the important part is that they, through their organization, have become convinced that the other, the immigrant, is causing economic harm, when that's not actually true. Immigrants don't get resources, right? If you're not a citizen, you can't, in California, you can't get like food stamps and other resources unless you have children that are then American citizens, and it's a whole other story that comes up with it, right? But the reason I'm using this argument is because it's flawed. Right? Actually, immigrants produce an economic boon to California, right? I grew up in a rural area of California. If we didn't have migrant workers, we couldn't bring in crops at all, right? That's just not, the argument is just not sound. So sometimes you have these economic arguments, right? Those people are ruining the country, right? They're ruining the country because they're draining the economy, or they're getting government resources, or they're taking up all the resources, right? Reagan had some, I mean, he's dead, so I hate to say this about a dead person, but Reagan had some really bad qualities, but one of the ones that was clearly racist is when he talked about like black queens of the ghetto, when, you know, black females having Cadillacs and lobster for dinner, right? That this was an economic argument that he made, was saying that these minorities were taking up all of these resources. Now, there wasn't truth behind it. And in fact, if you talk to Reagan, right, his rhetoric didn't really match his like personal beliefs. He bought into that sort of like rhetoric, and he probably was racist. But the argument was economic, that group was draining society of resources. Inaccurate as well, right? The other part is values, right? Now, economics you can fight. If someone says, oh, this minority group is draining all the resources of the country, we can count the resources, right? That's a quantitative argument. You're saying this group is taking up a disproportionate amount of the resources. Well, black females are about 4% of the population, and they're taking up about 1% of the resources of the government, right? Because a lot of it goes to like elderly people and military spending, and whereas white females are taking up disproportionate amount of government spending. So that's not true, right? That whites take up more resources than blacks per person, right? That's just a thing. There just happens to be more poverty in predominantly white areas, right? The parts of the states in Georgia and Tennessee that are poorest are also whitest. And I'm not making an argument here, I'm just saying that like, when someone says they're draining the economy, you can say, no, look at the numbers, you're wrong. So this is an argument we can have that you can sort of fight against scientifically. The other problem with pluralism is when you start to point at a values argument. They're taking our country away. They're changing our country, right? That you see this transition in the last sort of 20 years, instead of an economic argument, right? Republicans used to be conservatives economically, right? What we would call fiscal conservatives. They wanted lower taxes and less spending. And Democrats wanted more spending on certain services, right? And that's an economic argument you could have. What we saw in the last 15 years is a transition about values, right? We're not talking about economics anymore, we're talking about values. And when someone believes, through their organization, they're taught to believe, through the exaggerations and sort of the misconceptions of that organization, right? Because when you think it becomes less personal when you're in an organization. And so it's easier to sort of build up these beliefs that don't really hold merit, and it's harder to argue when they're values, right? And we saw this around 2003, 2004 as a reaction to 9/11. You see sort of more xenophobia, more concerns about minorities, right? And then all the things about losing the country, right? Losing the country because the values will change so much that it no longer represents the United States, right? That these arguments that you will hear some conservative pundits say that freedom of speech is being taken away from you, or that you're not allowed to express your beliefs, right? One of the things that happens most in our country, in the United States, that we see a lot of, that is a little unique, is that people will often say that they're being discriminated against when they are being treated equal, right? When they're no longer allowed to have some exception, right? When you're used to being treated as better, being treated as equal feels like discrimination. So what you've seen a lot is when we go through, say, 2006 to 2012, when a lot of rights are extended to people, some people feel that they're losing their values or they're losing their country. And you can't really have a logical argument with someone who believes that their country is being taken away from them. Their values are being shifted. Because you can't really have a logical argument about values not changing. Or their values might actually be the opposite of your values. And so they're going to say, this country is being stolen away from me. we no longer believe in these things, and you might say, yeah, we don't. We're going to fight about this, but that doesn't mean I'm ruining the country. That means I want something different, right? This is where pluralism becomes a problem. It stops being competition over ideas, and it starts being arguments that the other is a bad person, or the other group is bad, right? And that's one of the risks of pluralism. Extending on that is that some groups will push for a short-run benefit to themselves rather than a larger benefit over a long term to the entire public, right? And so what we have seen in many sort of Western European countries is in the last 20 years, there hasn't been really great infrastructure improvement. The bridges, the highways, the tunnels, they haven't been kept up in many of these democracies very well. And so what you'll see is if you compare Midwestern streets to streets in Southern Africa, what you will notice is in many of the Southern African countries, the roads are significantly better than those in advanced Western democracies. And the reason for this is because rather than have the groups in charge, the political parties in charge, go after and fix the infrastructure, they would rather get the benefits, the electoral benefits, by helping a minority that will help them stay in office. And what we see is instead of infrastructure, instead of saying we're going to fix the infrastructure in our systems, fix the roads and the bridges, what we're going to do is we're going to provide a tax break to a certain group. And that group's going to help us stay in power, right? Just so you know, sometimes when we have a tax break, you will see a large portion of the population support that tax break, but that tax break won't even apply to them. They're like, oh, the wealthiest people pay 1% less. When I'm wealthy, I'll pay 1% less, right? So sometimes when we buy into that, it's a benefit for a small minority, but it gives a large electoral win. The point here is that negative aspect is that instead of having a long-term benefit that applies to the entire public, it's only a short-run benefit to a small minority. So that's a very clear negative aspect. Now, the other part that we're always concerned about is organizations filling a public role. Now, there's a book by Suzanne Mettler called The Submerged State that sort of touches on this, but essentially the government should be filling all the public roles, right? Roads and bridges, prisons, right? Firefighters, police officers, military, right? Security, right? There are certain roles that should be filled by the government, right? That they have a public role. One of the things that happens through organization is the organizations take over that ability. Now, one of the ways this can happen is corporatism. Now, the book's a little older, so it doesn't really get into this, but corporatism is where you have an organization that's sort of setting the practices and standards of the industry that is not connected to the government. The most obvious example today is Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. These are setting their own rules. They are setting their own rules, right? The government is not setting their rules. And so instead of having a certain part of our public life, right? Social media is a part of our public life. That part of our public life isn't being regulated by the government. It isn't being sort of overseen by the government. It's being overseen by corporate interests. Now, not that that's good or bad, right? But the important part here is that instead of the goal to be the public good, the goal is for the companies to make money. Like corporatism, and I'm not saying that in a stigmatized way, I'm not saying in a bad way. Corporatism, the issue is that their goals are different, right? The issue is that their goals are different. One is to make money, and the government's goal is public good. And when the government's public good is not being served because the standards are being set by the organization, right, then you have an issue. Now, the United States just recently started having this corporatism through the social media companies. Before that, what we had was iron triangles. And you'll talk about iron triangles in your if you've had American government, right? I'm sure you talked about iron triangles. Simply put, it's just a legislative committee, a governmental agency, and a single interest group or industry that sort of work together, and it's a closed network, meaning outsiders can't get in, right? The most obvious example is the military-industrial complex. So in the United States, it's the Armed Services Committee, it's the VA, the Veterans Affairs, the governmental agency that deals with this, and then it's the VFW, or it's one of the companies, and they just sort of work together, and no one outside really has any say. No one really has any say. Or it's the armed services, right, the DOD, the Defense Department, and like Lockheed Martin or Boeing, right, who's making the weapon, right? And because it's such a closed network, there isn't really a lot of input. There isn't really a very democratic process, right? And so what matters here is not that they're bad, it's that they're not democratic. And not everything has to be democratic, right? Remember that we want to have a democratic system, but there are technical expertise that should be filled in certain places, right? We shouldn't vote on whether or not we use recycled water, right? We always talked about this in Nevada, right, about the use of recycled water, right? And I worked with a water services researcher, and they pointed out that the public doesn't really know that they're drinking recycled water. And if they knew and if they voted on it, they would vote not to drink recycled water. And the problem is there wouldn't be enough water for them, right? If we didn't recycle water, there wouldn't be enough water for the people that live here, right? So we always think about this, right? Not that these are bad things that have bad results, but they're not democratic. And you have to find this balance where you want pluralism and you want organizations helping fill the roles that maybe government isn't filling, but they're less democratic, and that will make the entire system less democratic, and that balance is necessary. All right, so we covered all of those things, so let's bring it all together and talk about democracy as a regime, right? Democracy is polyarchy, right, expanded, right? We have to have the 7 criterion institutions from polyarchy, right? That's free and fair elections and universal suffrage, right? Autonomous ability to join autonomous organizations, right? That you should be able to run for office, that you should be able to speak your mind, right? All of the criteria have to be there. Then you have to have a pluralist society. You have to be able to organize your beliefs, you have to be able to organize your ideas, and you have to be able to compete in that process, right? The competition and the organization are important. And then the last part, the part that we add to polyarchy and pluralism to get to a democratic regime, are the limits on power, right? And limits on power are very important, right? Now, in the United States, we have a Bill of Rights. We're the only ones that have a Bill of Rights. Very rarely do you have a sort of Bill of Rights. But in many states, they have rights. They have sort of rights that aren't violatable, or they have some sort of unwritten rules about how it should happen, right? The UK actually doesn't have a written constitution. They sort of have precedent, and they have these expectations, right? But they don't have a Bill of Rights in the same way. And many states have rights, they're just not as codified as ours is, right? That one of the unique historical aspects of the United States is that many of the people involved were attorneys, right? They went to law school. And so they wanted to codify it in sort of a legal way. And so we have a much more legal document that sort of formed our government than other governments did, right? That they didn't apply it in the same way. And because it hadn't really been done as many times, they wanted to codify it very clearly, where you don't see that as commonly happen. You don't see that happen as much now when democracies are being formed, right? You don't have very clear Bill of Rights. What you do see that has become the standard is checks and balances, right? If you want to be a democracy, yes, you have to have free and fair elections. You have to have all the criteria of a polyarchy, but there also has to be balances. And we'll actually talk about this in the next section when it comes to the executive, right? An executive needs to have a lot of power to get things done. But if it doesn't have checks on what it can do, if the legislative branch can't say no, or the courts can't say no, then it's not a democracy, right? An executive needs to have power to be effective, but it also needs checks on it to make sure that it doesn't become tyrannical, right? That you have to have that process. Okay. Stop sharing. Still recording. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so we sort of got criteria for what is a democratic regime, right? Polyarchy is the real clear details. We also want pluralism, we want competition ideas, and then we added some checks and balances and some rule of law, right? To make sure that we have a fully fleshed out regime. So now that we have a definition, a loose definition, but something that we can stick to, right? The 7 criteria are really important. Now that we're saying, okay, this is what an abstract, right? This is what we're going to call a democracy in the abstract. Well, now we need to apply it to states, right? We need to find some way to say, is this a democracy or is this not a democracy? We need to code that, right? So then we go into the Hagstrom article. We're not going to actually finish this today because I really want to grind into the math of it. So next Friday we're gonna do a little bit of review. We're going to review the exam, and then we're going to finish this off, and then we're going to go into authoritarian regimes. But I like 2.5 hours into a lecture, I don't want to get really into statistics. That's a bad plan. So we're going to finish a little early today. Unless I get bogged down. Okay. And so once we get to a certain point, we'll stop and we'll talk about it. So the first part is that we're going to look at a lot of index or indices, right? And what really just matters is I'm taking a lot of scores, a lot of variables, and I'm sort of combining them, and I'm getting an individual score. I'm getting one score, right? So Freedom House, it's 1 to 7, and if it's a 1, it's very free, and if it's a 7, it's not free at all, right? So it's got some categories. When we're talking about a democracy, we're often going to have this sort of dichotomous aspect. And we talked about what it means to be dichotomous before, but for democracy, democratic regimes, one of the things we're going to run into is if we say, okay, either it's a democracy or it's a dictatorship. Either it's a democratic regime or it's an authoritarian regime. Well, that's going to be a problem, right? Because there's this whole real world out there. And none of them are completely democratic and none of them are completely dictatorships. The United States is not a complete democracy. In fact, I would believe, right, I would expect that when we look at Freedom House scores for 2021, that our relative freedom score, democracy score, is going to go down, right? We had political violence. We had people reject the election, right? That there isn't a widespread acceptance that our election was free and fair by the people here. Now, just to be very, very clear, we have a very free and fair election. There's no evidence to the contrary. But we have part of our population that chose to become violent about it. We have part of our population that wants to change things in a democracy, wants to allow our legislative branches to invalidate the voters, right? That this is something that's happening, right? So the United States will probably decline in how it's scored as a democracy between 2019 and today, right? Because there are a number of things that have happened that made us less democratic and less free, right? The behavior, right? And just so you know that when we're talking about Freedom House, if there's political violence or if there's groups that don't accept the election, that causes that score to go down. So this isn't me saying it, right? This is Freedom House. They will code that as a lower score, right? But does that mean we're not a democracy? No, of course not, right? We are very clearly a democracy, but our score is going to down probably 1/10 of a point, right? A very small amount, right? Here's the threshold for being a democracy. Here's where we are, and we're going to go down here, right? So we're still going to be a democracy, but what is that informative if we're still so far from the threshold that there's no way for us not to be a democracy, right? Not in my lifetime. So maybe a dichotomous structure where we just say, okay, either you're democracy or you're not, that's not helpful. How about instead we have a continuous scale, right? That if you have a really low score, that means you're a dictatorship, and you're really high score, you're a democracy, but also you can be somewhere in between, right? You can be anywhere in between. And we may not have a word, we might not have a category, but if I say a really high score is democracy, really high is a dictatorship, and you're somewhere in the middle, does that mean you're partly free? Does that mean you're somewhat democratic, right? That gives us a little more information than a dichotomous argument, right? So the next part is, how are we looking at this really talks about our units of analysis, right? And well, I talked about the units of analysis, like the universal units of analysis, like the individual, the state, the system. That's Man, State, and War. The book Man, State, and War. Excuse me. But for us, the units of analysis or the types of analysis we're going to do are different. And this might determine whether or not something is a democracy. It might change how we feel if it's a democracy. Now, the first part is the legislative branch. Now, a legislative branch is democratic if it can write laws and then those laws are enforced, right? Or if it writes a law, the executive can't just ignore it, right? But that's one of the things that you have in an executive, right? Can the executive just ignore whatever the legislative branch is doing? If you look at Iran, it definitely can ignore what the legislative branch is doing, right? That the religious council can say, okay, you passed this law, legislative branch, but it doesn't fit with the moral council, therefore it doesn't matter. We're not going to enact it, right? You can't enact that reform. So the legislative branch isn't really democratic in Iran. And I hate to pick on Iran, I think like my expertise is limited to only so many states, right? I don't know every state. Right? I have no idea how Chile functions, right? Unless we do some specific article on Chile, I won't, right? Or Chad, or like Costa Rica. Other than that, they don't have a standing army, right? I don't know about every single country, right? So we're going to pick up, right? South Korea, China, Russia, Iran, they're going to come up a lot. And they're interesting cases, just, right? Obviously, I don't know every single country. The next part is this executive. Now, if you don't have an executive that's autonomous from other branches, that's going to limit your democracy, right? One of the things that is very unique about the United Kingdom is that the executive, the prime minister, is just the leader of the legislative branch, right? Parliament is their legislative branch. The prime minister is just the leader of the parliament. And so their executive is not autonomous. He's part of the legislative branch. Now, he has other powers, right? But he's not separate. And so that might have him treated differently than, say, a president, right? Where a president is autonomous from other branches. And the number of effective checks on power, right? Are we worried about whether that president can get the job done, or is that president reined in by any other part of the government? Next part is the voters, right? Do the voters have a direct say in policy choices? Do the election outcomes matter? In the 1960s, right, it didn't matter. It mattered less who you voted for because the policy choices weren't that different between Democrats and Republicans, right? Whereas today, the policy choices are very, very different right? So your vote matters more today because there's more differences between the parties. And then at the political party level, right, can the opposition replace the existing government? And this is going to be a big question we ask a lot when we're talking about the different types of regimes, right? If the opposition party can't take power, right, then it's not really a democracy, right? There has to be a way to transition power. And so this is a different way to look at a democracy, right? The three before that are saying, okay, can the government be effective? Can it be reined in by other branches? Do the voters really matter? This last one is, can transitions of power occur? And you have to have transitions of power to prove that the party that's in power isn't just holding on to it some other way, right? Do electoral rigging or something else that allows them to stay in power even when their voters don't want them to, right? There has to be the possibility that the opposition can take power. So this article starts with these four authors. Twersky is actually, Lemonji and Twersky are very, very famous, right? The other two are as well, but right now, Lemonji and Twersky have sort of come up more. And they were just looking at contests, right? How is the executive elected? How is the legislative branch elected? Is there more than one political party, right? We'll see later that many countries, they say, okay, we have elections and people get elected, but there's only one party you can belong to, right? If you're in the Soviet Union in the 1980s and you want to gain power, there are other political parties that exist, but the only one that's going to get you into power is the Communist Party. That's the only one that's going to get you into power. And so in the Soviet Union in the 80s, there was no alternation of power, right? There was just successors that took over when one person left office, but it was all from one political party. And so that didn't really match this aspect of a democratic system. All right. So the first one of the two things, it's Freedom House and Polity 4. So first is Freedom House. And I want you to think about how they get to the number that they get to. Because Freedom House first is not a democratic scale, it's a freedom scale, right? So one of the problems in our sciences is that sometimes we will say, oh, I use Freedom House or I use Polity 4 to determine if they're democracy. Well, the first thing is Freedom House doesn't determine if it's democracy, it determines if it's free, right? It's Freedom House determines if it's free. So if we're talking about Freedom House versus Polity 4, we're not talking about the exact same thing, so that's a bit of a problem. The next is the measurements are a little different, right? Freedom House deals in political rights and civil liberties. Right, rights are different from liberties. Rights, let me get this exactly right. Rights are the things that the government can't take away from you, right? That they can't pull away, right? So this is, when we talk about rights, sometimes we'll talk about negative aspects, right? And I don't mean negative. When we talk about political rights, not that they're negative aspects, but they're negative freedoms, right? Freedoms in which the government can't involve itself. Not positive freedoms where it has to help you, right? That it has to protect your freedom of expression, but that it can't damage that in some way, right? It has to be hands-off. And so political rights, the biggest thing is the electoral process. The government cannot influence the outcome of an election. It runs the election, right? It has an organization that runs the election, that makes sure the votes are counted properly, right, with observers, but it can't influence the election. It has to let the election be free and fair, and so the government has to step away from that. The next is pluralism and participation, right? This is where the government, again, it steps away, and people are allowed to engage in their ideas and organizations as they so choose, and the more that the government sort of disconnects from that and distance and allows the people to sort of autonomously have that behavior, the better and more free, not better, the more free that state is, or the higher score they'll receive. And the last is functioning of government, right? One of the things about political rights is, does the government function in a way that is responsive, right? Can you go to the government and file a petition? Can you go to the government and ask for a redress and go to court and set up all of those things, right? So that is one part of Freedom House's score of political rights, and it has 10 indicators. The next part is civil liberties. And civil liberties are where the government has to provide you with some protection or allow you to make sure that those things happen, right? These are positive aspects, right? Positive where they have to get involved. Not good, bad, positive, right? But just positive as they have to engage, whereas negative they have to not be a part of it. First is freedom of expression, right? One of the things that we see is not really about you being able to say something negative. It's really easy, if someone says something negative about the government and the government responds, it's really easy to see that repression. So that's really easy. One of the harder scores that we're looking at is freedom of belief. And it is difficult to tell if a government is not protecting a freedom of belief. Because what we might see is someone not get hired because of their religious beliefs, and the argument that is given is very different than the real argument, right? That, oh, I'm not going to hire this individual because they don't have the right qualifications, when the real reason you didn't hire them is because they were Muslim, right? Which was a problem in the early 2000s, right? People didn't want to hire Muslims, right? There was xenophobia, it was the post 9/11 era, right? That behaviors are very different, right? So this is harder to sort of get an accurate account of. The other part is organizational rights, right? Are they protecting your right to sort of organize in the way that you want to organize? Then, of course, rule of law. Rule of law is not just that the laws apply to everyone, but they are actively being applied to everyone in an equal way, right? That punishments are similar for similar crimes. The individuals who are at a higher elite status are being held accountable for their actions in the same way that people in the lower class are being held accountable, right? That all of those things have to be actively handled. And then, of course, individual rights, right? Is the government stepping in when individual rights are infringed upon, right? If your right to free speech is a friend of mine, is the government coming in and sort of fixing that issue? So then let's just do some quick math. Each indicator is on a 5-point scale, right? And what's weird is it's a 0 to 4 instead of a 1 to 5, but right, a 5-point scale, right? 0, 0, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a 5-point scale. I hate when they do this, but it's a 5-point scale. So there are 10 indicators on political rights, which means the highest score you can get on political rights is a 40. And so if you get 36 to 40 on political rights, Freedom House gives you a score of 1. I don't know why they do this additional translation. So if you get an index of 1, you have the highest level of freedom, you are free. And if a 7 indicates very little freedom, we're not free in a given state. Then what they do is they take the political score and they average it with the civil liberties score. And then they break it into 3 results: free, partly free, and not free. So the first part I want you to notice is that none of these say democratic, dictatorship, authoritarian. These are free, partly free, not free, right? Are you free or are you partly free? There aren't that many not free states left. Just as a world becomes more democratized, there aren't that many not free states left, right? You have a lot of authoritarian regimes, but they provide their people a lot of autonomy today. The other part is if we go back one slide, right? If we look at there are 10 indicators on political rights and 15 indicators on civil liberties. That means if you provided a lot better civil liberties, or if you provided a lot better political rights, right? If you said everyone has these rights and we're going to sort of step away from this and people are free to live how they want, then they have rights to not be bothered by the government. You might get a very good score on political rights, but then when it comes to protecting people's civil liberties, if you're like, no, we're not going to do that, then you're going to get a bad score. And you're going to end up with sort of a median level of partly free that may not fully represent, right, the result, the score that you should get. It may not fully represent how free you are, right? If you're very free in that no government never interferes with you, but it provides no protection either, right, you would fall under this partly free category. And this averaging obviously creates some issues about identifying exactly how free a state is. But that was Freedom House. So now it gets even messier with Polity 4. And one of the things about Polity 4 is that it uses these two scales, this democracy scale, or the democ scale, and this autocracy, this autoc scale. And if you look at the first three aspects of these, the first three dimensions of these scales, they all have to do with the executive. How many people can be the executive? How competitive is there more than one person who can be the executive? Remember we mentioned China, only one person was going to be president. Right? President Xi Jinping was going to be president. And now he's president for life, right? If you look at Latin America, often there'd only be one or two people that could be president, and they were from the same party, right? So it wasn't competitive, right? Only one person. And many people were excluded from running from the presidency. At sometimes people in different parties would be barred from running for office because they were in the other party. But what matters here is it's so much focus, right? Polity 4 is so focused on the executive. So focused on the executive. And much more focused on the executive than Freedom House is. And so if we're comparing the results of these scores, we're actually not looking at the same thing. So when we're talking about trying to find some way to look at what democracies are, the measure you choose is really going to matter, right? Polity 4 is going to give you a measure of democracy, but in a way that is very focused on an executive and participation, right? Can you participate? Whereas there are many other aspects like civil liberties that are in Freedom House. And so their scores are going to be different because they're looking at different things. So let's do the math on this one as well, right? The way this one works is we take the autocracy score and we subtract it from the democracy score, right? So if you have really good democratic institutions, but you also have some autocratic behavior, you're going to get somewhere in the middle, right? And then the scale goes from -10 to +10. It's actually a 21-point scale because the 0 in the middle, right? So it goes from -10 and then hits 0 and then it goes up to 10 and gives us a 21-point scale. But it's continuous and there are no categories, right? So if you look at a polity system, it doesn't say, okay, this one's a democracy, this one's not a democracy. It just says, okay, on this scale, dealing with the metrics and the dimensions that we have, this one's a 6, or this one's a -2. And what that means, right, has more to do with the scale itself, right, than whether or not it's a democracy, right? But we need some scale, right? We need some scale. And so most of the people in political science have shifted to Polity 4, right? Because it directly tries to measure if it's democracy. But most people don't actually pay that much attention to how it's calculated. The other part that we want to talk about is Polity 2. So the important part about Polity 2 is that if I were to give a score to how democratic a state is in 1970, I might not give it the same score today as in 1970, right? But often if we look back, the scores that were given to those states in the 70s, 80s, and 90s seem high. They seem high based on today's standards. And so Polity 2 adjusts those scores so they're all sort of fitting to the same sort of standard, right? The coding of the numbers, right? The coding of the variables is the same, and the points are set up the same way so that we can do a time series analysis, right? All that allows is a time series analysis, right? If we look at one set of standards for what it is to be a democracy, we can look at in Polity 2 whether or not a state became more democratic over time. And time series analysis can really benefit in that way, right? And we'll actually talk about this later, right? Because sometimes we care, is this state more democratic today? And sometimes we care about how democratic a state is in relation to another state. So is democracy a scale or is it dichotomous? Now, when we say a state is democratic, usually we give it a cutoff point. For a lot of places, they choose like 6 on a polity 4 scale, which seems high, but anything sort of between -6 and 6 is a mixed regime, 6.1 or something to 10 is a democracy, and -6.1 to -10 is an autocracy, right? So you have this big mixed area, and then you have to get a certain cutoff point. Now, that cutoff point might be useful. Maybe you say if you're under here, you're not a democracy, and we want to see something in democracies. Remember, when we're doing this, we're choosing the research question. We're choosing the thing that we want to look at. So if I want to look at democracies, if I only want to look at democracies because I want to talk about something like electoral politics, right? Electoral politics really only makes sense in democracies. So I need some sort of cutoff point that decides what cases I use. So that might be very useful. But then, is that cutoff point the right cutoff point, right? Or should we create a bunch of different categories that help us identify all of the points on the scale that might need some sort of different interpretation, right? We might have partial democracies, right? There are a lot of places that are democratic in their elections, right? But there's no competition among the parties. Or they have elections, and actually the parties all can win, but they're not allowed to have any autonomous organizations. So the opposition's allowed to run and campaign and try and win offices, but they're not allowed to organize, which makes it very difficult for them to be competitive in elections. The other part is that we might have some special case. So I really don't know. I think for younger people, this is a very different conversation, but it doesn't seem like the hot topic it used to be, right? When I was growing up, no one wanted to talk about Israel and Palestine. But in Israel, right, they're a democracy, but they don't allow many of the Palestinians that are citizens, right, or the Palestinians that live in the territory to become citizens and engage in politics, right? That if you're Palestinian, ethnically Palestinian, then you can't really get into power in Israel, right? And so what one author argued was that Israel is an ethnic democracy, that if you're not Israeli, right, you can't really be part of the democratic system in Israel. So it's not really a democracy, it's an ethnic democracy. Now, I don't know if that's true, I don't really want to make the argument, but the point is that would be a special category, right? And these special categories might help us understand the different types of democracy in a way that gives us a better scale, right? And so sometimes we want the scale, but sometimes we might want it to be dichotomous, right? We might want a specific category where this is a democracy and everything else is not a democracy. And there'll be times when that's very useful. All right. So there are 2 different types of comparison. There's time series analysis and cross-sectional analysis, right? And I talked about these before, so I just want to spend a second here. If we compare the United States in 1912 to the United States in 1968, would we say that the United States has democratized? Now, let's go back, right? Let's think about polyarchy. Was there universal suffrage in 1912? No, absolutely not, right? You don't have suffrage for a few more years. You don't have women's suffrage until the 19th Amendment, right, which is not forthcoming. It's about 8 years later, right? But you also, right, don't have the Voting Rights Act, the 1960s Voting Rights Act, right? The sort of civil rights acts that come in the 1960s, right? The Warren Court in the 1960s and 1970s, right? So the suffrage alone, just universal suffrage alone, the United States is more democratic in 1968 than in 1912, right? Those are things we can look at. And I'm using those examples because you should know, like, you should know, like, not that you're going to get tested on, but, right, you should know women's suffrage occurs in the 20th century, like 150 years after the start of the country, right? And then it's not until the 1960s that minorities really fight back against sort of Jim Crow and New Jim Crow, right? So those are democratizations, right? And that's just our example, right? There are hundreds of examples of time series analysis where over time a state becomes more democratized, and that can be a really good way to say, are they a democracy? well, they weren't a democracy before, and then this thing changed that allowed them to have better suffrage or universal suffrage or better freedom of organization, and now they're doing a little bit better. So I think because we weren't really willing to classroom democracy yet, now they've done the thing that we wanted them to do, to be able to say, okay, yeah, this is definitely a democracy. So time series can be helpful in that way. The other part is cross-sectional analysis, right? If I wanted to see if certain states were democratic, and I was comparing to the US, UK, China, Sweden, and Chile, right, it would be very easy to see that the United States and the UK is a democracy and China is not. Now, Sweden and Chile, right, Sweden would be a democracy, but it has some other functional aspects that are a little bit more socialist. And then Chile has a bunch of, the executive has a lot of power, right, so we'd be comparable. So Sweden and Chile are in the middle ground. You're like, okay, let's look at those. China, definitely not a democracy. The United States and the UK, in these cases, definitely a democracy, right? And so sometimes when we're looking at an analysis, it's not always that helpful to just look at one state and say, is it democratic? It can be much more helpful, right? Sometimes the comparison, the benefit comparison, is it clarifies a lot of things. What is dramatically different in the United States and China is that China censors its press, right? It has state-owned media, right? It doesn't allow freedom of organization. When you see that sharp contrast, it makes it very clear which aspects are democratic and what is missing from certain states. And so China is a good example because they have capitalist institutions, they have democratic institutions. In fact, they have some elections on small government, right? So they have all of those aspects, but they're also a socialist country, right? A recognizable socialist country, right? They have all of those aspects, and it gives us great comparison. And for most of the time, what I want you to work on, right, because eventually you have to write a paper in this class, I want you to think about cross-sectional analysis, not time series. Time series is hard, right? And I don't want you to get bogged down in it. I want you to focus on cross-sectional analysis. What does it tell us about the UK when compared to the United States? What does it tell us about, right, when we talked about Scotch, Poland, Guinness? What does it tell us about France, Russia, and China when we compare it to Latin America? We're talking about Scotch, Poland, Guinness argument, right? That comparison is really what's going to be the bulk of this course that I want you to focus on. Okay. I don't want to get into this. So this is the first. This is the first aspect where they explain, right? What matters here, I can't really show I don't think you can see the cursor when I'm looking at it. But what's really important is if you look at the bolded numbers, the percentage of change in democratic scores between countries is very different between the two scores, right? Nearly 80% of difference in Freedom House scores is determined by space in the first aspect, right? Where only 3% is time-based, right? That means the change in Freedom House scores was only 3% based on time, right? But if you look at Polity 4, 70% of the changes were in space and 10% were on time. So obviously, the two different measures are picking up different things. And so therefore, when we look at how we measure a democracy, it does matter because we may not be picking up the same things. And if we're discussing comparing democracies or we're discussing how they've democratized, if we're using different scores, we may not be talking about the same dimensions, and we don't want to be having an argument where we're talking past each other. We want to make sure that we're speaking the same language and we're having the same conversation. Okay. This is something that we'll talk about later. I'm not worried about that. So I am going to finish a little early. I owe you a little bit of time. We sort of kept getting behind. We were going to sort of catch up. I wanted to go a little faster, but right now, you're not going to have an assignment until next week, because I really want to get through the exam first and then move on. Hold on. So at this point, are there any questions about any of the material? Oh, and just so you know, I will upload the YouTube aspect. It's supposed to be uploading right now. So the videos will get uploaded on YouTube so you can watch with the slides and everything. You just won't see my face. But I got a couple of your emails I'm going to be responding to after this. You'll see a quiz or an assignment next week. And then what I would like to do is when we come back, if you have questions about the exam, when you get the grading back, because you'll get it back either tomorrow or the next day, I'm actually quite quick when it comes to grading. I know what I'm looking for and I can score pretty quickly. Write your questions down and then I want you to ask them in class, right? I want that to be a thing that's happening. And because YouTube's not functioning, and these recordings, the WebEx is supposed to be recording the share and everything. I'll see how that video goes. I'd like to go to all WebEx, and I would like, starting with next week, for there to be more commentary and questions, because right now I don't have any feedback except the exam. So ask questions when we come back about the exam. Why did I get this score? Why was this different? What is different about this? And then from that point forward, anytime you don't get a perfect score on something, right, talk about it in class, right? Because anytime that someone has a question, they always think it's just their question. But typically, the question applies to like 10 other people who just didn't ask it, right? So just feel comfortable asking. I appreciate everyone coming in today. You should see everything posted and your exam grades by Monday, and then I will talk to you individually. If you emailed me about something specific or you need an extension or something, you should hear from me in the next few hours. And if you would like to sort of, when you get your score back, you'd like to talk about it, we can email, we can have a meeting with that as well. All right, thank you everyone, have a good day. Thank you for coming in.